Fear is the path to the dark side.
London calling to the faraway towns. Now war is declared and battle come down. London calling to the underworld. Come out of the cupboard, you boys and girls. London calling.
Consent of the governed, a value outlined in the Declaration of Independence and for which arguably the revolution was fought. What did you find and what were you looking for when you asked this question? Does the government have the consent of the governed?
Well, you know, we track this on a regular basis along with other measures of the health of our democracy and our economy and the political system, and this indicator has been getting consistently worse. What it measures is a general distrust of the political process. It's not Barack Obama and the Democrats or George Bush and the Republicans. Both parties have worked together on a bipartisan basis for decades to completely alienate the American people. Just 43% now believe that elections are fair to voters, the lowest number we've ever recorded. The 17% who say we have the consent of the governed, that's the lowest ever. No matter how we ask the question, no matter what way we're approaching it, we're finding record-setting dissatisfaction. And Judge, the reason is pretty, we can talk about politics and tactics and speeches, but here's a simple fact. For the last 4 or 5 decades, every presidential candidate has promised to cut spending and taxes. Just about every congressional candidate has promised to do the same. But the last time government spending in America went down was 1954.
Wow.
I mean, so there's no connection between what people are voting for and what the end result is. That's the disconnect, and we see it in issue after issue.
Might this yearning for control over the government and this perception of a disconnect between the governed and the government explain the rise of candidates like Ron Paul and the rise of his end the Fed and don't spend more money than you take in attitude? And might those attitudes be flourishing, like you found, I think, recently in your last poll in Iowa?
Well, yes, it does fuel the rise of candidates like that, and I think we read too much into it if we say it's a particular ideology. It is a frustration. In 2006, they vote against the party in power. They do it again in 2008. They do it again in 2010. And nothing happens. A majority of Americans have so much distrust they think any tax hike should have to be approved by voters before it goes into effect.
Wow.
Same thing on changes in Social Security and Medicare. 2 out of 3 voters think no change should be allowed until the voters approve. It's not because of a particular policy desire, it's that they don't trust the process.
They don't trust the government.
That's right. And look, these numbers are showing the same levels of anger and frustration that we saw in November of 2010. Strong disapproval. The president is back up to those levels. 62% say if they could vote to keep or get rid of the entire Congress, they'd say throw them all out. 46% say most members of Congress are corrupt. Highest we have ever found. And again, it's measuring up to this overall cynicism. 52% think their own representative in Congress, their own person, is likely to trade votes for cash. Those are the numbers. People are fed up with the way our government is working or not working.
Each party has a chance to prove themselves now, and neither one has. Neither the president nor his Republican opposition have looked like leaders positively to a better country.
Both parties, an independent party, what's going to happen?
Well, we were in the focus groups just a little bit back and asked people out of curiosity if a new party formed that said it picked 435 people randomly out of the phone book, calling itself the phone book party. Would you vote for that?
So far.
Would you vote for that or one of the 2 major parties? And every single person in both focus groups picked the phone book party.
And well, that's the rub.
And that's because right now there's that upset. And upset's, you're right, it's too general a word. There's enough anger, disappointment, a real feeling of failed leadership.
Pat Caddell today, he's talking about the sentiment is pre-revolutionary in his view. Do you agree?
I don't know if that's going too far because we haven't lived through the revolutionary era ourselves. But I have never seen in my lifetime, or my children's lifetime, or my parents, this kind of feeling of anger. I mean, now we're angry. In 2008, it was disbelief. What happened? Why weren't people telling us what was going on?
When Newt Gingrich and the Republicans took over, it was the year of the angry white male. That's when the Republicans took over the 104th Congress, when we had the balanced budget. Right. But now you have angry people. And for people to want to vote for people in the phone book instead of the people in Washington, D.C., It's not a Democrat problem. It's not a Republican problem. It's a political problem.
It's a feeling that they believe the political class has fallen out of touch with their lives and their problems and what's going on.
The sentiment is pre-revolutionary in his view. Do you agree?
I don't know if that's going too far because we haven't lived through the revolutionary era ourselves.
When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them.
A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government.
Any longer. You've always had the power. You've always had the power.
That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government.
Laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness.
Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes.
And accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed.
But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security.
Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government.
The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states.
To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world.
The government plays a trick on all of us. It's called taxation by inflation. When the government borrows, especially when it does so from the Federal Reserve, that causes prices to go up as the value of the dollar goes down. This is a cruel thing for the government to do, because it hurts the most those who can afford it the least, right where they need to spend, on food, on clothing, and on fuel. The government likes inflation, even though it is a form of fraud and a form of default. Think about it. If you lend $1 to the government, but it pays you back with another dollar that can only buy 50 cents worth of goods at the time it pays you, the government has defaulted or defrauded you on the second 50 cents. Investors know this. So when the debt deal, no deal, the one that lets the president increase his borrowing to $6.7 trillion in the 4 years of his presidency became law, smart investors fled to gold, which increases in value even when the government plays its tricks. Enter the Federal Reserve. It doesn't like gold because it can't control the price of it. So it sends signals as it did today. It might give the banks more money to lend, and it might give the feds more money to spend if investors would just get out of gold and back into the market. And the Fed didn't do anything new. It just promised to keep interest rates artificially low. All this happened. A market nosedive that caused the loss of 15% of value off the high this year. A downgrade in the government's credit rating for the first time in history. A central bank artificially creating easy credit. Because the Congress and the President cannot address the issue of debt in a responsible way. They just want more of it. They cannot make hard decisions. They cannot do what we elected them to do. They've effectively decided not to decide. Government and centralized power is the reason the poor are poor and the weak are weak, and the reason many people can't find work. Welfare systems were constructed not to combat social ills. If they were, they've failed miserably. Rather, they were constructed to create dependency among the governed that would tie their health and well-being to the health and well-being of the government. As the parallel construction of warfare and empire building shows, the government can be very effective in mobilizing to advance its goals. The important thing is never to confuse the government's stated goals with its truly intended goals. For example, government schools aren't failing, they're succeeding in creating citizens who have a broad misunderstanding of history, limited critical thinking skills, and a stifled sense of expression, because this is what the schools were built to teach. On the other hand, the Clinton-Bush-Obama war policies didn't fail, despite the sectarian violence unleashed in Iraq or the increasingly bleak and haphazard violence in Afghanistan. Nation building and counterterrorism were their stated goals, but the intended goal is to lubricate the gears of the military-industrial complex while continuing to push the boundaries of American empire deeper and deeper into the affairs of foreign peoples and countries. Libertarians don't want to dismantle the warfare-welfare state so as to allow barbarians at the gate, nor do we want to condemn the poor or the weak to destitution. Government has condemned the poor and weak to poverty and weakness. Government has used its authority to destroy those tools which individuals and communities can and have used to secure the conditions they desire for themselves. Government, in fact, uses authority to break communities altogether by taking the responsibility for the poor and the weak, and so de-incentivizing individuals, their families, and the community from doing so. This explains why the government distributes more in welfare than it collects from people who pay taxes. We turn to the government instinctively at the first sign of trouble or disorder. We submit unquestioningly to its authority and assume its best intentions. We should not do so. If we are serious as a people about taking care of the poor and the weak among us, then we should get serious about it. When we allow the government to take care of our social ills for us, we shrink from our own personal moral responsibilities. And all we get is more social ill and less freedom. The answer is to return to first principles. The government should protect us from force and fraud and then leave us alone. It must recognize that our freedoms come from our humanity, that our souls are immortal, that it is merely a temporary institution based on fear and force. It cannot spend more than it takes in. It cannot kill except in actual self-defense. And it cannot take our property and give it away. Freedom is the ability to obey your own conscience and free will. Government is fear and force telling you what to do. Shall we keep a government in power that does this to us, or shall we replace it? The answer is obvious. For our freedom and our prosperity.
But we must address them in a way that we want the world to understand. Nonviolence. Martin Luther King taught. We're getting ready to salute him in this country. He marched nonviolently. And all of us must remember that as the effective way. In my life, I've had to try and remain faithful to that. And even the words I choose, I've never, ever tried to incite violence, but I've been careless with language, and I've had to learn that we must become the change we seek. Don't ignore the problems, but don't become the problem. Gandhi said, become the change you seek. Thanks for watching.
London calling to the faraway towns. Now war is declared and battle come down. London calling to the underworld. Come out of the cupboard, you boys and girls. London calling.
Turn them off!
This is the theater of the absurd, my friends. This is the theater of the absurd.
Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering.